So we have Callum McMenamin
Yeah.
over Zoom. Callum, are you able to accept as a panelist? Oh, there you are. Great, I can see you. Fantastic.
Kia ora.
Welcome. You've got 5 minutes.
Cool.
Please proceed. I'm just acting chair while Ryan's just getting the link working. Good to have you here.
Thanks. So kia ora, I'm Callum McMenamin. I work as an accessibility consultant. I help organisations make things accessible for disabled people. So I've read the Regulatory Standards Bill, and basically my main feedback on it is I believe it needs an additional principle for good lawmaking that considers compliance with relevant United Nations conventions. So, for instance, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The New Zealand government has ratified this convention. However, in my experience, the government has failed to properly implement this convention in its lawmaking. One recent example is the repeal of the Plain Language Act, where this convention was not considered at all. The legislation guidelines from LDAC were not considered properly. The Cabinet Manual was not considered. So that's why I think the Regulatory Standards Bill could act as an additional measure to keep a check on lawmakers to make sure all laws pass certain levels of quality and considering certain aspects like UN conventions. There's other conventions like the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Rights of the Child, and a Convention Against Racial Discrimination. So all of those could be sort of combined into a single principle. One other thing is I really like how the Regulatory Standards Board, you can actually complain to it if legislation doesn't meet the standards. The Ombudsman can't do that, for instance, as far as I'm aware. So I think that's a step forward. Another thing, one of the first principles says that laws should be clear and accessible. I would really like it if these terms were defined a little bit better. So from my point of view, accessible means that disabled people can access it, which I think is a pretty good principle. Just making that a bit more clear if that's the intent. There's also another point, another part of the principles is that it says every person is equal before the law. I have seen a lot of commentary that this might remove the potential for affirmative action. So that is taking positive steps for a particular group of people that have suffered discrimination in the past in order to gain equity. I think you could change the wording there and say all humans have equal value before the law. That's just a slight tweak to the wording where it acknowledges we value everyone equally, but we might treat people a little bit differently to correct wrongs that have occurred in the past. So I think that would be a good change to the wording. Another thing is, when I was considering how the Regulatory Standards Board operates, I think it will lack independence. Basically, the minister can hire and fire board members at will. So board members probably won't be very independent because they will want to keep their roles and the funding that they receive. I think that board members should be appointed by the Chief Executive of the Ministry for Regulation so that it is not a political entity. And finally, I have read the Waitangi Tribunal report on this. I think that the government needs to really consider that report and fix up all of the problems that have occurred, for instance, not consulting Māori. I believe that those issues can be resolved and it won't be the end of the world. I think it can all be fixed and we can actually get a good set of standards for our regulations in place. So I think it's all fixable and that's what the government should do. So kia ora, thank you for listening.
Kia ora, Callum. Thanks for your submission. I'm sorry, Mark, we're at time and
all good.
No thanks to me having some technical difficulties running a little bit late. So yeah, appreciate your submission, Callum. We've got Donna next. Clark and team, I'm just wondering with the transition between Zoomers, if we could have them up sort of almost ready to go, actually up in the panel with us, just to maybe make that transition a little bit faster as well, if that's possible. We've got Donal McLean. Welcome, Donna. I can see you just coming on. Or Donal, sorry.
Sorry, yes. Hi.
There you are. Welcome. We've got you for 5 minutes. I'll let you get straight into it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me on the submissions board. A minute's silence. A minute's silence for the death of democracy, says I. No time to waste. I have a playbook to baste, says he. In my playbook, the magic is to make the rich richer while I slur the poorest. Push all sorts of bills, create confusion while causing an economic contusion. A minute's silence for democracy. Oh, no. You've got me, David Seymour, as referee. Do it fast, one upon another. Roll up the next, a perfect smother. Growth, the economy, what wisdom I speak. And under it all, subversive control I seek. Unwind, unroll the great public good, while pretending to all to be Robin Hood. Permissions to expand 100% and not even listen, pillorize active dissent. For them that paid tithes, why they all get free rides. Double speak is rule number 1 in this playbook of mine, and Seymour's for me and those who I bind. We'll strip the cupboard bare and mortgage the future, and only the rich, to the best, will I offer a suture. My playbook, my plan is a doodle to do, because my mates are the only ones with votes. Are you? A minute's silence for democracy, says I. In the opening gambit of this political game, I took the crown, I made my bold claim, says he. Oh, democracy, sweet democracy, the salve of the middle. I'll state it, I protect it, while on it I piddle. Any bastions against me, I'll roast and make fun. They'll be reduced to a poke, a belittling pun. With my minute, I believe 100% that my short time in power has amassed my portent. I'm an 8% tail that wags a great dog. The greater numbers are twerking in a nascent pretend fog. Ministers gathered around Seymour, exterminate, pulverize the horrendous poor. Capture executive power, I say, give license to money give sway. Luxon behind, Peters attend, Jones on repeat and Brown and pretend. This minute, a submission, in submission, the tiniest voice in this pretense of processing, says I. 6 judges before me, mostly asleep, I pretense of process, the price is so steep. A minute of silence, please, says he. Lieutenants, if I might, it's a moment of history. Will it pass? It should, right? Punching way above the weight of my very small vote, I expect your full backing, or my backers they'll float. Away to another haven where their money get better spent, greater freedoms for all, on that they're hell-bent. All meaning them and their mates and their grifters, the stakes though sky high they will win from middle-class drifters. Atlas himself, owned as my fair god, holds up our free New Zealand sky. Libertarian freedom is freedom to boot camp and freedom to deny. Atlas wrote this playbook, refined it often. Think tanks international, Hayek, their boffin. Our coffin, says I. Chapter and verse, New Zealand, Atlas are getting. Great God that he is, on New Zealand they're betting. Might as well speak, says I. A silence, for my 5 minutes given. Atlas interpreted, a mythic illusion. An illusion mythique, says he. A metaphor, a portentous, cultureless, emboldened by money freak. So at minute 4, says I call again for a minute's silence, wherein we can roar with the sound of a bottomless, portentous, impassioned, humane, musical score. A minute's silence, says I, and in the silence yet go. Democracy caught, reined in, reined on, if we don't say no. A tiny Seymour glow, says he, because I'm a shoo-in, I know. That is my submission, no RFB. I vote no, I vote no, I vote it down and out. I vote for the we that the best in us becomes, if we vote for the we that democracy sums. Thank you.
Thank you for that submission. That's taken us to full time. Apologies, Mark. We'll keep you carry over to the next question if we can. We're now going to go to YouthLaw Aotearoa for an organisational submission.
Kia ora koutou, ko Darryn Aitchison, takuinga. Love a good poem. You'll see from our submission, the written submission, that we oppose the bill for two broad reasons. The bill is a threat to our democracy and a threat to the interests and well-being of children and young people. We're not going to go through that submission in detail. If you've not read, I did read something over the weekend. If you've not read the commentary by Sir Geoffrey Palmer published on Newsroom last week, I urge you to do so. That really addresses the democratic part of our concerns. It outlines a range of reasons why the bill is bad for democracy. Some of those are that the bill is rushed, it's sloppy, and it lacks detail, but it also disrupts widely accepted democratic principles which have evolved over hundreds of years. It creates confusion about the role of the court, the role of ministers, whether Parliament is subjugated to the views of a single minister or a hand-picked board. In our view, it is terrible, terrible law, and it comes at a time when democracies all over the world need all the help that they can get, not rushed, sloppy, and disruptive law like this. Democratic ideals are not nice to haves. They are not only abstract ideas, they have real practical consequences for individuals, communities, and humanity as a whole. In championing this bill, the ACT Party asks us to imagine what human beings could do if they were free to do it for themselves without the politics and bureaucracy. Well, history will tell us exactly what can happen. The democratically elected Nazi Party was free to make 400 laws which gradually eroded Jewish rights and ultimately led to the Holocaust. The South African Parliament was free to remove democratic representation for non-white people during the apartheid era. And in America, the land of the free, slave owners were free to buy and sell human beings. White states were free to segregate their schools, and gun manufacturers are still free to flood the market with 400 million weapons. In our work at YouthLaw, we see the impact of bad law on children and young people every day. In some cases, the primary cause of this harm is a lack of restraint in the economic and market settings of Aotearoa. New Zealand has the highest vaping rates in the world. This is a travesty, and it's happened because Parliament was too slow to regulate. It persists because Parliament is not willing to regulate and restrict the supply of these products. A major review of online pornography laws in the United Kingdom has found a lack of regulation is causing harm to children in society. This lack of regulation means that people are free to make and view legal but harmful pornography, like choking sex, violence and degrading acts, and content that encourages the sexual abuse of children. Lack of regulations means that people are free to make and use artificial intelligent apps which produce harmful, life-damaging deepfake pornography. This is happening in New Zealand classrooms. Children and young people are being harmed in New Zealand today because the same unregulated markets that happen in the UK are happening here. This bill will limit Parliament's ability to regulate these products and protect children and young people from harmful consequences. Intellectual property rights of the online producers of harmful pornographic content will take priority over the wider public interest of protecting children and young people. The best way to protect children and young people from this harmful content and these harmful products is to restrict its production and circulation. But under this bill, there is every possibility that taxpayers would be expected to compensate producers of this content and these products simply because we wanted to protect our children. This bill is crazy. This is bad enough, but there appears to be a grotesque logic buried in this bill, which is not good for markets. In creating this pathway for compensation, it appears as though this bill actually incentivizes the creation of a new market whereby people will actually create harmful technologies and products, knowing that that will lead to legitimate compensation expectations when they are regulated. I can imagine a society when human beings are free to do it for themselves without politics and bureaucracy, and I don't like what I see. We see it in our work every day. There are two types of freedoms. There is the unrestrained freedom of little or no government, which is the freedom that opens the door to tyranny, injustice, and harm. And then there is democratic freedom, a freedom which is based on human rights. And this is the freedom that promises to protect us all from the extremes of human behaviour. I think this is the second type of freedom that New Zealanders want. It is certainly the type of freedom that our children deserve. And I do not know what the New Zealand First or ACT Party thought they were agreeing to when they agreed to support this bill into law, but I don't think you were agreeing for harmful AI porn production apps or the next Pike River. I urge you to be the champions of democratic freedom and to turn this bill away. Thank you.
Thank you, Darryn. We don't appear to have any questions. So we'll leave it there, but thank you for making the time today.
Thanks for the opportunity. Kia ora.
Kia ora. We now welcome Greg Mossong in the capacity of a personal submission. Welcome, Greg. Are you there?
Thank you. Yes, here.
Fantastic. Welcome. You've got 5 minutes, so we'll let you get straight into it.
Thank you. This is a personal submission. I am actually currently a government policy advisor. The submission is focused on particularly on Section 8 of the not sure. Maybe I'll turn the camera off. Given that looks like it's the ceiling. Yeah, the submission is focused on Section 8, in particular fees and levies. I have, my background is that I've been involved in preparing, designing 3 cost recovery tools over the last 20 years. By a cost recovery tool, I mean something where the legislation identifies both how the money is raised and how it is spent. Section 8 of this bill identifies 2 types of cost recovery tool. One it calls a fee, where there's a direct relationship between one individual and how it's raised and spent. And the other it calls a levy, where there's a relationship between a group that money's raised from and spent on. They're fine in themselves, but if you compare that with the existing set of statutes, in addition to those 2 forms of user cost recovery, there is a third one that is not provided for in this bill. It's one where you raise money from one group and it's spent on a somewhat wider group that's specified in legislation. Existing legislation tends to call these 3 provisions fees, that maps exactly to fees in the bill, charges, which is the levy in the bill at Section 8F, and then existing legislation, when it talks about a levy, is almost always talking about something where money's raised from one group and spent on a different group. In my view, all 3 tools are legitimate ways of raising or recovering user costs. And I just wanted to draw the committee's attention to the fact that one of those tools in the toolkit, the existing toolkit's missing. I think it was probably missed in the departmental consultation process. But the essence of my submission is that the bill should provide for all three types of cost recovery that we have in the existing acts: fees, charges, and levies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Sounds like a useful submission that I'm sure our team will theme up. So thank you for your submission today. We've now got Health Coalition Aotearoa. Who's leading you off? Boyd, is it?
Kia ora koutou, so ko Boyd Swinburn toko ingoa. Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to participate in this very important democratic process.
Welcome, Boyd. We've got 10 minutes, but just to remind you, if you want any questions at the end, just leave some time if you could.
Sure, yep. Okay, thanks very much indeed, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this democratic process. Hopefully the weight of the voices of the people that you're hearing will carry through into the appropriate destination for this bill. So I co-chair Health Coalition Aotearoa. It's an alliance of over 60 health and community groups advocating for regulations to reduce the harm from our three biggest killers. That's tobacco, alcohol, and ultra-processed food. So between those three, they create about a third of our preventable annual health loss. So we are very keen on good regulations, but we strongly endorse the thousands of submitters who have pointed out these things that you've probably heard over and over again about the bill failing 3 times and very narrow principles, no certidity, environmental, health or social impact, overwhelming opposition to the bill from the public, from scholars and experts, government agencies and so on. So we believe that this bill is unequivocally not the best way to improve the quality of regulations. But I'd just like to be able to put the public health risks that this bill poses. And the problem that we face in trying to get regulations to prevent harm is not so much that the existing regulations that we have are poor and have been badly written. No, it's that we have too few regulations to constrain the corporate power and the corporate exploitation of people, especially those who are struggling the hardest. So we have this regulatory chill. So New Zealand does very poorly on this front of regulating harm products. We have, for example, no effective regulations to protect children from marketing of alcohol and ultra-processed foods, to control the nicotine and addiction-enhancing chemicals in cigarettes, to prevent the high density of fast food outlets and so on. So this regulatory chill, the lack of regulations, is the threat of pushback from the corporations, and that rather prevents politicians from making the policies in the first place. And this bill, we believe, will undoubtedly increase the levers for regulatory chill, perhaps turning it into a regulatory freeze. So I just want to give a very concrete example of this. So in Australia, Nicola Roxon was a very rare example of a brave health minister who really understood the value of regulations in improving health. And in 2011, she led the passage of the plain packaging of cigarettes into law. So, of course, the government was immediately taken to the High Court by the tobacco industry. Philip Morris changed its headquarters to Hong Kong so that it could use a free trade agreement with Australia and take Australia to an investor-state dispute tribunal, and the industry supported challenges through the World Trade Organizations. So these legal challenges to this piece of public health regulation were multiple. And what were the grounds that the industry used to prosecute its case against the Australian government? Well, it was the acquisition of property and rights without compensation. Its trademarks, designs and colours and so on that would be unfairly taken away, and the government was not going to compensate them for it. And this is exactly the same provisions that are in this bill. So did these challenges succeed, legal challenges? No, they didn't. But the process ran for 9 years, including all the appeals, cost the Australian government more than $50 million to defend it. And it was only after these cases were settled that countries like New Zealand were able to drop the regulatory chill on that and actually implement it ourselves. So they did achieve an increase in regulatory chill for nearly a decade. And so while the officials in the Ministry of Regulations tried to reassure me that corporations would not be able to succeed in using this bill if it passed into law in the same way, I think it's very naive to think that the industry would not weaponize the privileging of its private property and rights in this bill. In fact, this is what this bill is designed to do. So in our view, the best outcome from this select committee process is that it upholds democracy against the ideological drive of a minor party by listening to the people and implementing other ways of achieving better regulation that the Ministry for Regulation and the other government agencies and all the experts that you're hearing from are recommending. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Boyd. We'll go to Mark Cameron.
Afternoon, Boyd. Thank you so much for joining us on the select committee process. Boyd, would you be aware that the second chief concern of the constituency currently is that the health sector is underfunded and under-resourced and having a productivity crisis? Now, that's the constituency saying that. What do you think the reason for the constituency being so concerned about the health sector in general would be?
Yeah, so the constituency sees health largely as hospitals and GPs and so on, and that surely is overworked. A lot from these preventable diseases for which there are regulations around alcohol, ultra-processed food leading to obesity, diabetes, car crashes, alcohol problems, tobacco, and so on. There are plenty of good regulations which we have not implemented in this country, which would help reduce the pressure on healthcare services. So, yep, hospitals are visible and people see that as a concern, but really we're not doing the prevention well, and that's because we do not have enough good regulations.
Okay, Boyd, as a supplementary, thank you, Mr. Chair, very quickly, how do you then square, sir, that we've gone in 5 years from spending $18 billion on health to now 32 billion, and yet outcomes are worse? Do you think, sir, that there's a case of that we've got, in some instances, poor regulations that perhaps maybe the Ministry of Regulation could weed out so we actually get better productivity to the doctors and nurses?
Yes, I'm not sure what those regulations are that you're talking about that are creating that. I'm talking about the prevention side where we simply just do not have good enough regulations. And I think that this bill will add to that problem. I don't think it's going to reduce it. I think we should be taking the advice of the experts and the agencies about better ways to regulate.
No further questions. Thank you, Boyd.
Thank you, Mark.
Francisco.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your submission, Boyd. One of the things that I'm interested in your submission was you mentioned how there was skepticism you expressed about the reassurances you've had from the Ministry for Regulation officials. They've said to us that Section 24, which is that the Act doesn't confer any legal rights or obligations, means that the corporations being able to use this to have a regulatory chill those concerns aren't valid. Can you explain why you still have concerns despite that assurance, Boyd?
Well, I think that the history shows that these industries with very deep pockets will use whatever legal levers they can. And I use the example of the tobacco and the Australian one, which was pretty clear. But we've seen that also in New Zealand with the alcohol policies, with supermarkets and the alcohol industry preventing the introduction or the proper introduction and implementation of local alcohol policies. So I do think we need good regulations in there to be able to prevent the corporations from weaponizing it and using it. In the end, it may well fail, but don't forget that they are trying to delay and create more chill for these regulations to be in place.
We're still just in time. Megan Woods, the question.
Thank you, Boyd, for your submission. I share your view that the best case scenario is that this bill doesn't pass into law. But we have heard from a previous submitter that if it is going to be passed into law, some suggested amendments, one of which was that it doesn't apply to existing regulations, so it's not a retrospective piece of legislation. Just wondered around your views on that.
Yes, I've seen quite a bit of commentary about its use on retrospective legislation, and I think there's a whole lot of uncertainty about what that's going to mean. I'm not an expert in that space. I think the biggest problem to me sits in the principles that this is privileging a couple of things that need to be taken into account, not the totality of what needs to be taken into account. So if the bill was going to be amended to make it more useful and have better impacts, those principles would need to include all of these things that the submitters are including, and that will then follow into the other regulations and probably then applied to retrospective legislation if that's going to be the case.
Yeah, thank you. We have met time. Thank you, Boyd, for your fulsome
Kia ora,
submission.
thank you.
Kia ora. We've now got Louis Board up online. Welcome. Just got,
Kia ora, can you
you're
hear me?
away. Kia ora. Yes, we can hear you.
Sweet as. Looking at this bill, I do not see a piece of legislation. I see a small minority party reshaping the very fabric of Aotearoa. Decades of precedent, debate, social justice, and activist work will be undone in one fell swoop. This legislation is often described as deeply divisive. I argue, however, that this is not the case. The last time the public was allowed to have a say, 23,000 New Zealanders spoke their minds through the submission process, with only 0.33 supporting the bill. This is David Seymour's fourth attempt to pass this legislation. Each time it has been overwhelmingly rejected by the people of Aotearoa. The government that governs best is the government that governs least. This is a direct quote from David Seymour speaking on the House floor. A quote that, in my opinion, encapsulates the aim of the Regulatory Standards Bill. It is a view that is unrealistic and undemocratic. The idea of cutting bureaucratic red tape sounds great in theory, as we have seen countless times throughout Aotearoa's history. Unregulated industries are not to be trusted. I will remind you of the Pike River Mine tragedy. This event took place on November 19, 2010, resulting in the devastating loss of 29 New Zealanders. Since then, we have seen significant changes to workplace regulation, including the Health and Safety Act in 2015. This, however, has not resulted in safer work conditions, with nearly 10,000 Kiwis having died from occupational health issues or workplace fatalities since that date. An average of 1,000 deaths per year, 3 per day. This does not include the nearly 500,000 workers injured in the workplace over the same period. Regulations and safety standards are written in blood, the blood of thousands who have died trying to put food on the table. These are not statistics, these are people. I have another quote from David Seymour, again taken from the House. This bill is a crucial piece of legislation for improving the long-term quality of regulation in our country, and ultimately allowing New Zealanders to live longer, happier, and wealthier lives. Well, in my opinion, this bill does not aim to do that. It is the exact opposite. When a significant portion of our workforce, especially Māori, are employed in high-risk industries such as forestry, agriculture, and manufacturing, now is not the time to reduce regulations and safety standards. I also would like to talk on housing. In a country where 1 in 3 Kiwis are renting their home, including me, it is shameful that this bill is even being considered. Think of the majority of renters whose homes have mould, the almost half who live in damp houses, and the third of New Zealanders who can see their breath inside their own homes. Back in 2019, the Healthy Homes Standards was introduced, aimed at revolutionising the rental market and giving renters a chance to live in a house that is fit for purpose. This bill seeks to dismantle the over half a decade of precedent set by that act. I will again raise the issue of cutting the red tape, which has already been attempted in the housing sector. In 1993, when the 1991 Building Act came into effect, the industry was allowed to take the reins, and we saw the emergence of the leaky building crisis. Companies cut corners to increase their profits, as without regulation, they were free to do things on the cheap. This not only caused several thousand homes and commercial buildings to fail to meet any sort of safety or health requirements, but also cost the government billions of dollars. This is something that has affected tens of thousands of Kiwis and will continue to affect them if the bill is passed. The industry does not know best. It has failed us time and time again in the name of profit, and will leave Parliament to clean up the mess. We must aid our renters, not the landlords that have been graciously given billions in tax cuts to. Instead, we need to force them to meet the standards. In a cost of living crisis we have not seen since the financial crash, this bill seeks to give even more power to the landlord and developer class. It is unfair to everyday New Zealanders. It is unjustifiable to allow our most vulnerable to suffer. Unquestionably, this bill represents a return to our neoliberal past that did nothing but create suffering for the working class and our most vulnerable. In summary, I believe this is an appalling piece of legislation that will not only set Aotearoa back decades, but will also result in people's lives being lost, the health of our nation worsening, and a social unravelling. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your submission. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're now going to welcome Kiwis for the treaty.
Should be coming. Hi.
Hi, Mike.
Should be appearing. Oh, hang on, I'll turn the camera on. That might help. There we go.
Yep. Fantastic. Welcome. We see you, and you've got 10 minutes with us.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, I don't think I'll take that long, but tēnā koutou, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm speaking as chair of the members and supporters of Kiwis for the Treaty, which opposes the Regulatory Standards Bill. We're a diverse group of New Zealanders. We've got everything from students through to doctors, farmers, lawyers, builders, etc., and across the country. But our key sort of unifying interest is that we believe the treaty is a key way of unifying New Zealand and making us more successful. We're not aligned with any political parties on either side. In fact, our members have voted for every single party. In terms of background, my work has been in private investment, corporate management, and originally as an RMA lawyer. I'm also a fifth generation Pākehā New Zealander. There's two things I really wanted to talk about. One was some of the principles that have been drafted, and secondly, just to maybe walk through a scenario of how the bill could be used, because I think there's a
Oh, was it just me, or did we lose him?
I've lost him on my screen as well.
Someone pushed the red share button.
It's not there.
Okay, we'll give him a minute to come back. Otherwise, we have to re-jostle him.
You see it?
Yep, you're back.
I don't know what happened there. Anyway,
Karen.
yeah, okay. So look, in terms of the first issue, I suppose when we look at the way the bill has been drafted, it puts great weight on including the rule of law, and of course everyone would agree with that. So sort of key provision throughout England, Europe, and the Commonwealth. But the interesting bit is when you get to the equality principle, which really deals with majorities and minorities, it says every person is equal before the law. And we've heard that repeated a lot on TV, and we get that. But actually what it's failed to do is it fails to reflect the actual principle that was set out by senior English judge Lord Bingham in 2006. And why that matters is because the actual principle, the rule of law about equality, which most of the English-speaking world at least follows, says that it has an extra part to that same sentence, which says, save to the extent that objective differences
justified differentiation. So that's a proviso to say that in a democracy, you will have minorities of all sorts of people. It might be Māori, it might be fishermen, it might be, I don't know, raft of things, crochet knitters, I don't know. But the point is, that is the exception to the rule of equality. So when people have an objective difference, that should be provided for. And so I don't know why that's missing in this legislation. Maybe someone from that party can explain why they chose to only put half the sentence in, but they did. But its absence will have a profound effect on minorities. And its absence will, I'm sure, raise eyebrows across the Commonwealth and further as to why this New Zealand, who has been a well-known democracy, has decided to jettison the very core part of its rule of law. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about was the international treaty principle. One of the other principles that Lord Bingham set out was that as part of the existing principle, the rule of law requires compliance by the state with its obligations in international law. The law, which, whether deriving from treaty or international custom and practice, governs the conduct of nations. And then he said, I do not think this proposition is contentious. No, neither should it be. But again, it's not there at all in this legislation. And again, why has there been a bit of a cut and paste job on this and a selective editing? Accident or intentional, I don't know. But if it's there, then it just reminds the government and reminds the Regulatory Standards Board that there is an international treaty obligation, and it's the obligation under the Treaty of Waitangi, which by anyone's reckoning is and was and still is an international treaty that we're bound by. So again, ACT may or may not have a rationale as to why they chose to do that. Now, the second thing and sort of that I really want to talk about is just really this issue of, well, what does it all mean? And I think everyone's got a bit confused on that, including myself at times. But I've decided I'd try and run scenarios to say, well, if we get this legislation, what could happen? And I suppose one of the key things for a select committee is the job of spotting the wolf in sheep's clothing. So it's crucial that, you know, the select committee spots bills that look nice and friendly but can cause havoc if they're enacted. And that's an issue that with societies that's gone right back to the days of when Christ delivered his Sermon on the Mount and he mentioned the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's where it comes from. Well, I would argue that this bill is one of those ravenous wolves, which if passed will make it much easier for the government to do things such as sell public land, strategic businesses and state-owned assets. And some commentators have argued that that actually is the really true rationale for this whole piece of legislation and why it's been pushed so hard for so long is because of the interests of some parts of the economy in accessing those assets or people from overseas accessing them. Because there's no actual reason to do it. We know the current system works very well. We've got government departments saying it works very well. And we've had international agencies saying that it works very well. In fact, we've got one of the best quality of regulation in the, globally. So then I suppose the question was, so that, okay, well, whatever, let's see what would happen if you decided to do something like sell Pāmu, which has been talked about for a long time, and it could be Transpower, one's worth 2 billion, one's worth 5 billion. They're quite material to any government's budget. So Pāmu, big business, 110 farms, 360,000 hectares, 1,000 staff. Variety of crops. One of its core purposes is to hold land for possible transfer to iwi in future treaty settlements. So I thought, well, okay, what's a realistic thing that happen? Well, the government could get an offer, say 2 billion from an overseas agricultural fund, and that offer is conditional on Pāmu's assets, all of their assets, and the transaction being completed quickly. So what's the response? You get farmers who say, no, that land should be sold to us in New Zealand. We're the best people to do it. and we don't have enough time under the overseas investment. You've got environmentalists who say, oh, these people are terrible, and you get Māori saying this land was meant to be protected for us. But the government says, no, we've got to keep going. They know there's an issue with the State-Owned Enterprises Act, and they know there's an issue with the Overseas Investment Act. But by pushing this legislation through to enable this act to happen, the Minister of Regulation is able to advise Parliament that the liberty principle says that they should be able to sell those assets. The treaty is not relevant. There's no relevant criteria. Social impact on farms is not relevant. Potential environmental effects are not relevant. So this, there's no good reason for this not to go ahead. And then you go, well, that's the wolf in sheep's clothing, and it's arrived, and it would have a dramatic effect on New Zealand economy when you start putting those level types of transactions together without the public being involved. So not saying it's a right or wrong thing to do this types of sales, but if it happens, it needs to be one that considers all the issues across all the groups, and then the Parliament can make its decision. So now that's submissions. I hope they're of some help.
Thank you for that. Yep, we are nearly at time, so we'll leave it there, but thank you for that.
Okay.
Very fulsome.
Thank you very much.
We're now going to welcome the Māori Women's Welfare League. I'm not sure who's leading off for it.
Kia ora.
Dr. Hope, kia ora.
Kia ora.
Welcome. We're in your hands for the next 10 minutes. Of course, feel free to leave a couple of minutes at the end for questions if you would like.
Okay, I'll try. Oh, thank you, kia ora. Yes, my name is Hope Tupara, and I'm the National President of the Māori Women's Welfare League. I'll take it that you've read the written submission of the Māori Women's Welfare League, and I'll also refer you to the written submission of the Māori Women's Welfare League dated Monday, the 13th of January 2025, that was submitted to the Ministry for Regulation during the consultation process of the proposed RSB. For clarity, this oral submission and the written submission were not created by a bot or any other type of artificial assistant. The written and oral submission were prepared by me, and I'm also not deranged, nor do I have any related syndrome. I've read the Regulatory Standards Bill, so the submission is not based on misinformation either. The comment I will make is the Minister for Regulation is content on continuing propaganda that references to Te Tiriti are race-based, and that is his rationale for omitting Te Tiriti from this bill. He is wrong. He wants citizens to be convinced that Te Tiriti is a race-based document. He is wrong. It's not a race-based document. And if you believe that yourselves, the League would be happy to sit down with you and talk about why it is a document for peace and flourishing for all of our nation. The additional comments or questions I have are as follows. The RSB role in maintaining consistency with sections 22 of the Constitution Act that concerns parliamentary control of public finances, which makes it unlawful for the Crown to spend public money, for example, except by or under an Act of Parliament. I raise a question about the connection of this role and treaty settlement processes not yet under an Act of Parliament. The League as a charity has accessed legal aid under a number of Waitangi Tribunal inquiries, and more specifically as an original claimant of the Manawahine inquiry. I met last week with staff from the Ministry of Justice over the current review of legal aid, and there's also a review of the Waitangi Tribunal legislation going on, for which we will be putting in a submission. So my question is around whether that kind of activity is considered to be something that's not under an act. The other comment I want to raise for your attention is under section 8E and F. Will we be charged in future for legal aid? There is also a mention of a class of payers. What does that class of payers look like? In terms of part 32 about the complaints system, there's too little detail about the complaint system. So how will it work and how will it be funded? I support the submitter, Callum McMenamin. Sorry, Callum, if you're listening and I've said your name wrong, that the RSB does not recognise international agreements, which includes the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The recommendation for our submission is written to you, but our opposition to this bill stands for the reasons in our written submission, both this process, but also the proposed process, the proposed regulatory bill at that time. Another question I have is the RSB Act binds the Crown. It's extremely difficult to reconcile how an act of the Crown or an act that binds the Crown does not recognise Te Tiriti o Waitangi. We also recommend that you extend the time for oral submissions to align with the number of submissions that have been received by you and ensure all voices are heard and their input considered fairly. That's the end of our submission.
Thank you, Dr. Hope. There doesn't appear to be any questions. So thank you very much for both written and oral. Oh, there's one from Francisco Hernandez.
Okay.
Thank you,
Hope
Chair.
it's not a hard question.
Well, hopefully it won't be a hard one. And thank you so much for your submission up and the work that the Māori Women's Welfare League does. I think one of the things that that you've raised in your submission that hasn't come up that much is the information seeking powers that the Ministry for Regulation has among non-public agencies. Can you elaborate on your concerns around that section, which is point 6 of your submission?
Well, we struggle already to keep up with all the demands that government has on us. I get emails almost daily asking us to consult. So I guess the question is around what might be expected of us. I mean, we're audited anyway, so in terms of that, we're always trying to improve our systems. But it's the expectation of voluntary organisations like ours. That's unclear.
Right. So you think it'll just add regulatory burden to organisations that are voluntary that receive public funding?
Well, I don't think any voluntary organisation like ours is worried about an inquiry into our processes, etc. However, we don't have the same machinery of government that the government has. We don't have staff I'm not saying that government has staff available either, but we probably have a lot less resources than the government does. If it expects us to behave in the same way as maybe more resourced organisations do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks once again for the work you do.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. We're now going to welcome Hilda Halkyard-Harawira, who's providing a personal submission.
Hi, kia ora.
Kia ora, welcome.
Tēnā koe.
We're in your hands for 5 minutes.
Okay, kia ora. Right. Up here in Te Tai Tokerau, when you wear sunglasses, it's because you're either going to go to sleep in a hui or because the person that you're talking to you that's talking to you is telling a whole lot of lies. So anyhow, I'd like to wear I'm not saying that that's you personally. I'm just saying when you see people in Tai Tokerau, they either think you're real upstanding or full of it. Anyhow, this proposed real sinister bill, RSB, I liken it because I don't want to, I've submitted my submission and I don't really want to say what I've already said in there and a few others. It's a flatliner in a hospital emergency room. It's a bland nothingness, which kind of mirrors the absence of humanity of its designer in a way. And I call it a real shite bill because it lacks good, fair governance principles. I don't see anything in that framework that talks about good health, education, well-being outcomes, nor respect for all members of the community. There's more respect for the individual, the money makers, And I kind of think it's a backward step in the development of Aotearoa as a potentially leading Pacific nation. So anyhow, about this, I call it the real kaka bill. It's a whitewash. It promotes historical amnesia of the terrible past colonial behaviour, which we thought after 185 years we were putting behind us as a distant memory. But it's like a bad dream coming back to haunt you. This bill does not protect nor recognise the constitutional mana of he whakaputanga me te treaty or Waitangi, and will effectively, this kaka bill will rewind all the long fought Māori gains made in yesteryear, such as our treaty settlements and many other gains that we've made as many hapuiwi and Māori. I do worry that this bill will deny, in its blandness, will deny proactive kaupapa Māori initiatives and affirmative action programs, which ensures we have more doctors, more dentists, more engineers, etc., and successful education in the field of kaupapa Māori, kura kaupapa Māori. This bill kind of reverses all the hard work done by, our tupuna, both Māori and Pākehā, and Pacifica and Asia, who worked really hard over the last many 50 years to build a solid and meaningful bicultural nation of Aotearoa. And what I really dislike about this bill, it kind of uplifts personal liberties and economic and property rights over collective rights. So like if I liken it to your street floods, would you expect your neighbours or your rescuers to help out everybody in the street, or just the shopkeeper or the vape store owner? Because that's kind of where this RSB thing goes. And I when I say I still hold the government responsible for good governance, if you don't believe me, then you should, if you need white affirmation of what is good governance, then maybe the government, you politicians, could look at some of the principles laid out by your own Auditor General. So, horikau he tino kōrero atu I tērā. I just wanted to make that known. I find all these submissions kind of tedious, so I do appreciate that I got 5 minutes, and I'll leave it at that. Kia ora.
Kia ora, and thank you for your submission. Your position is very clear, and some nice shades you got there too. All right, we're going to welcome Nicolas Haden now. He's also doing a personal submission.
Hello. Yes, thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, you're in place in Wellington. Welcome. Sorry we couldn't be there with you.
Yeah, one of the few who's actually turned up in person. Okay, so what I'd first like to do is go through a couple of the actual drafting points that I made in my submission. So overall, I'm in support of the bill, but there are a couple of clauses I've identified which I don't believe are clear enough or go far enough. The first one being clause 5A, where if the chief executive believes that the legislation they are putting up is consistent with the Regulatory Standards Act, there's actually no requirement on them to detail why they reached that conclusion. All they actually have to do is say, yes, we did it. And that is going to make it quite difficult to do any consistency checks afterwards. So the first recommendation I'm making is that there be some requirements put in there to actually specify why. What was the analysis done to conclude? Because at the moment, you only need to put analysis in if you decide that you want to be inconsistent. The second point is on principle 8K, and that is the one about costs and benefits. At the moment, it's not clear where those costs and benefits lie when the analysis is being conducted. So my recommended changes there are that it refers to benefits for New Zealand and costs of the legislation to public or persons of New Zealand, i.e. to narrow down the scope so it's not necessarily anyone anywhere in the world. It refers to New Zealanders because that's what the New Zealand Parliament's responsibility is. So those are my specific drafting comments. So the other comments I want to make are around the point that this RSB is needed, and it's not just because of poor legislation by previous governments. Even this current government, I think, will have fallen foul of it if this act had been in place. An example here is the Climate Change Response Emissions Trading Scheme Forestry Conversion Amendment Bill, quite a long title. Now that bill impaired the property of landowners who might otherwise have wanted to convert some of their land to forestry. It didn't provide any compensation to those landowners who wanted to do that. It just, their right was taken away. Now, I'm not saying that that is bad law. That legislation may well be entirely justified, but the decision not to compensate that impairment didn't have its reasons documented. And that illustrates the underlying reason why this bill is important, because it imposes a requirement on the government to, as I put it, show you're working, which is similar to what you might have in a maths exam or something. It's not sufficient just to come up with an answer. You also need to explain how you got to that answer. And that, to me, is what this RSB will require. So that's why I support it, because of the requirement to show you're working. Now, some of the other comments I've heard from other submitters have been around alleged inconsistency or not matching up with the Treaty of Waitangi. So what I did is I had a look through the principles to see how consistent they are with the treaty. And if I just run through quickly, so principle A, the rule of law, all of those in there, particularly A2, that's pretty well aligned with Article 2 of the treaty. Equality before the law, that's Article 3. A5, that's pretty much Article 1. If we look through some of the others, liberties, that's principle B. Article 2, taking a property, that's Article 2. Some of these others are not addressed, but they're not inconsistent, such as taxes, levies, and fees. Then if we go down to 8G, it's Article 1 again. I, Article 2. J, that's not inconsistent. Some of them didn't really have any meaningful applicability in 1840, such as 8K, because cost-benefit analysis didn't really exist in 1840, so you might expect the treaty wouldn't have talked to that. So when I look through it, I don't see anything in there that is inconsistent with the treaty. There's stuff there that's very specific, and there's other stuff that's silent. So I don't see that there is any problem there. And my final point is that to those who are opposed to the bill, particularly persons in other parties, I would say that there's no need to repeal the bill or the subsequent act entirely. The principles that are put into it can be added or deleted over time. But that should be done in a transparent manner. So again, coming back to this show your working point, if there are some new or better principles, they can be put in the future. Because to say that you want to throw it out in its entirety is effectively saying you don't want to have any principles at all, and that effectively is unprincipled politics. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nicolas. Yeah, very succinct and articulate presentation. So I appreciate you coming in.
Okay, thanks.
We're now going to hear from Transpower. I think they're back online. Organisational submission. We've got Raewyn, Moss and Joe joining us. Welcome, ladies, and you've got us for 10 minutes, but of course you can leave some time for questions at the end.
Thank you. Thank you. Kia ora, and thank you for the opportunity to present today on the Regulatory Standards Bill. Being conscious of time, we'll keep introductions brief. So I'm Raewyn Moss, EGM, Customer and External Affairs, and with me is Joe Moore, our Senior Corporate Counsel. And I think you'll no doubt be familiar with who Transpower are. We're the owner and operator of the National Electricity Transmission Grid. and we're here to talk to you about the existing regulatory regime that applies to the grid and that we expect to continue to apply, and the potential impact of one particular clause of the bill, clause 8C. Perhaps just to touch on, so electricity lines have perhaps an unusual sort of regulatory regime compared to other infrastructure. So I'll just touch on that briefly. So the bulk of overhead lines that make up the national grid were constructed during the 1930s, and then from the 1950s through to about the 1980s. And at that time, at the point that they were being built, there were offers of compensation, and acquisition would have been under the relevant regime at the time, probably including the earlier versions of the Public Works Act. And in most instances, formal property rights were not necessarily obtained. As a result of that, about 93% of our overhead lines, which run the length of the country, rely on statutory rights under the Electricity Act. And the Act authorises the occupation of land and sets out the work that can occur on our lines before compensation is payable or property rights need to be obtained. So the need to obtain property rights is mostly triggered in urban areas, occasionally in rural areas, where we might be upgrading lines, for example, adding a second conductor to a line. The Electricity Act also provides protections. So regulations under the Act set safe distances, for instance, for locating buildings and earthworks from lines. And there's also regulations around vegetation trimming, all designed to ensure that public safety and that the assets aren't compromised. I'll hand to Jo.
Thanks, Raewyn. In addition to the Electricity Act, further protections for existing lines are provided via national direction under the RMA, and this national direction requires corridors around the lines to prevent inappropriate development from being established, and the relevant restrictions also relate to buildings, structures and earthworks. And the national direction package for phase 2 of the RMA proposes that those restrictions be placed in regulations under the RMA, and these protections are important, particularly for avoiding additional or new housing being constructed under lines. So inappropriate development can compromise existing electricity lines, whether it's buildings, construction too close to the lines, trees falling into the lines, and it can also have a big impact on public safety. So against that background, we've lodged quite a targeted submission on clause 8C of the bill. And as you'll be aware, that sets out one of the principles for responsible regulation, and it provides that legislation and also regulation shouldn't impair property without landowner agreement unless there's good justification, fair compensation, and that the compensation is payable by the party benefiting. And we're concerned that any review of the Electricity Act and the regulations under it could potentially fall foul of the principles set out in 8C, and we're particularly concerned about potential for compensation to be revisited, with additional compensation being payable for existing statutory rights and protections that apply to existing lines, and ultimately any revisiting of compensation due to clause 8C would be borne by the electricity consumer. So to address this situation, we've suggested that the Electricity Act and regulations under it are exempted from clause 8C, and we've also suggested that protections afforded to existing infrastructure, including under the RMA, are likewise exempted. So we're happy to take questions.
Very good. I can see there's a question from the Honourable Megan Woods.
Thank you, and thank you for your very detailed submission. I've got 2 questions. One is the section around compensation that could be required and that would fall on consumers putting up power prices. You've talked about the fact that people bought properties knowing that the Electricity Act allowed these lines over their properties, and you talk about over 11,000 kilometres of transmission lines. Have you done any back of the envelopes of what the impact on people's power bills, whether they be households or businesses, would be?
No, we haven't. But I mean, you're quite right that we have it. You know, the asset base is extensive, and I guess we have no idea at what level compensation would be set if that was to occur.
But
It would be
expensive.
But it would be expensive, yeah. And
It would not be factored into TPM, would it? Or would it just be a flat fee?
I guess I mean, it would be something that would need to be worked through very carefully, because to find, and I guess we're hopeful that this doesn't occur, but if it was to occur, that it would have to be considered in a very, you know, as to how do you do this in a way that's administratively simple, without creating
anything that pushes up power prices is of a concern. The other one is my second question, Mr. Chair, if that's okay. It's a quick one. Is around one of my favourite topics, the tree regs. And we know that we need to be strengthening our regulations in regard to our distribution and transmission assets in the case of extreme weather events and keeping the power on for communities. How would you see as this cutting across our ability to provide resilience into New Zealand's electricity infrastructure?
Yeah, I can answer that one. We have touched on the tree regs very briefly. Certainly the trees regs is under review now. At the moment, they only relate to trimming of trees, so we could potentially be having to, I guess, compensate for that, even if it's an amenity tree, but it could have big implications on the ability to amend that legislation to address tree fall risks, particularly where it relates to forestry. And certainly my understanding, you know, potentially the smaller forestry blocks that sort of plant and then walk away and they come back only when it needs to be harvested, we could have issues there in terms of the need to compensate for inappropriately planted trees. Yeah, so it could absolutely cut across resilience. Yeah.
Supplementary, Mr. Chair. So we know during Gabrielle that actually people not maintaining some of those forestry blocks actually led to significant outages of power for communities. Are you saying this would make it even harder for us to make sure that we had that resilience in our electricity network?
I think it could well do that, depending on how the requirement for compensation played out. Certainly under the Electricity Act at the moment, we can't get on and do work until compensation is agreed where it's triggered. So if there's that kind of regime put in place in terms of that payment of compensation, it could impact on that.
And we have had examples where, you know, sort of agreeing compensation before work can be done can go on for years and years, which is obviously not particularly satisfactory from a vegetation perspective.
And would also push up power prices if there's having to be more compensation for this. So pretty gloomy picture all round.
Yeah, there is one other point I would make, that we haven't made this in our submission, but I am concerned that there is the potential for compensation under a whole lot of different pieces of legislation and regulation for what is essentially the same transmission line. So there's that potential for not just compensation once, but multiple times.
Thank you. That'll be something for our officials to note in the process. Thank you both for your submissions, Raewyn and Jo. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're now going to hear from Tohu Media. I think we've got Leeann and Kandy presenting.
Tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koutou, we're in your hands. You've got 10 minutes, but of course leave some time for questions at the end if you'd like.
Kia ora. By way of introduction, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā kārangatanga maha, o ngā iwi, o ngā motu. Ki te Committee of Finance and Expenditure, ngā mihi o te ahi. Good afternoon. Ngā mihi for the opportunity to give our oral submission today on behalf of Tohu. Ko Leeann Wahanui-Peters tōku ingoa, ko Kandy Wahanui-Peters tōku taina, my younger sister. We are tangata whenua of Tāmaki Makaurau. We are 2 of 3 whānau directors of Tohu Media, a Māori-owned company which develops artificial intelligence, AI, to protect the intellectual and collective rights in Māori taonga. We identify and validate the cultural interests of iwi and hapu. This intensive IT innovation journey is marked by 4 years so far of hard work under the management of Kandy and the team. Tohu does not support this bill. We do support or tautoko the submissions in opposition by experts who have come before us, such as Sir Geoffrey Palmer, Annie Makaire, E Hongaroa, Māori o Aotearoa, and Carmen Jones, and tomorrow Professor Jane Kelsey, amongst other experts. Kandy will highlight 3 main points from our written submissions in the context of why we have concerns with this bill and its likely negative impact on Tohu media and undermining the foundations that are necessary for its work and more broadly Aotearoa's potential in the global IT sphere. And finally, we would like to take questions in the remaining time. I'll hand over to Kandy.
Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou. Why Tohu Media cares. We champion Aotearoa's technological sovereign future. How? Mātauranga is our competitive edge. It offers solutions the world needs: sustainable resource management, enriched knowledge databases, and ethical AI. Working with iwi hapu, Tohu Media enhances both modern and traditional knowledge systems. For example, there may be areas that data scientists don't know about, but they can apply local knowledge and customs passed down over the centuries with the creation of customized algorithms unique to that hapu or iwi. Sovereignty through infrastructure. We own, build, and process our AI models locally. We store and share data locally. This isn't just cultural protection. We are building technological sovereignty for Aotearoa. Aotearoa first in practice. Our concerns, the bill's threat to sovereignty. A, silencing te tiriti, silencing innovation. The bill excludes te tiriti from its regulatory principles, which is a breach in itself. This isn't merely constitutional vandalism, it's economic self-sabotage. Māori knowledge partnerships depend on the Crown's duty to honour its obligations to Māori for Māori to protect our taonga. B, undermining knowledge sovereignty. Data sharing powers could force disclosure of culturally sensitive innovation systems to foreign third parties and possible foreign exploitation. Regulatory efficiencies tests may pressure agencies to adopt cheap foreign AI over Māori developed tools. C, global leadership at stake. Aotearoa can lead the world in Indigenous innovation, but this bill favours international standards over local-based knowledge, treats mātauranga as a regulatory hurdle, not an asset of economic, cultural value. It sacrifices our unique advantage to be a global leader of Indigenous technology by prioritising deregulation over cultural guardianship and innovation.
So in closing, he whāriki mātauranga o Aotearoa te taonga. Māori knowledge is Aotearoa's taonga. Tohu is blending tradition and technology to protect our cultural taonga. This bill cynically and unintelligently dismisses that unique value without having a full understanding of the opportunities domestically and globally. Aotearoa needs to lead globally by honouring Indigenous innovation and not wasting taxpayers' funds on a bill that is not needed. Tohu stands by its calls to reject the bill. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. We will take questions. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you for that. There doesn't appear to be any questions at this stage. So we'll take your submission and make notes on that accordingly. But thank you both for the day.
Tēnā
Okay.
koe, tēnā koutou.
Thank you very much.
Kia ora. We're now going to hear an individual submission from Tāwhana Chadwick.
Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou katoa. Can I
Kia
start?
ora and welcome. Yes, you may. Yep, you've got 5 minutes. Welcome.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I am a mokopuna of Ngāti Hori, Ngāti Whakaiti, Ngāti Kurukuru, Ngāti Rora, Ngāti Rereahu, Ngāti Manunui, and Ngāti Hekeawai. I'm also a member of many other communities. I'm Indigenous to Aotearoa and a descendant of European whalers and European colonizing settlers who included missionaries, labourers, prospective landowners and farmers. My name is Tāwhana Chadwick, and these many identities I carry compel me to speak to you today to utterly and completely oppose this Regulatory Standards Bill and its ideological underpinnings, and to recommend to the Select Committee its complete rejection. The Regulatory Standard Bill sits on layers and layers of myths and lies that remain pervasive in the minds of those who willingly or unwillingly attach themselves to white supremacist ideologies. These myths of their superiority and, on the flip side, our inferiority lie at the foundation of the institutions of the New Zealand government. They are namely to be human, that to be human is to be European, is to be white, is to be superior, is to be an individual, is to dominate, is to experience privilege and entitlements. To be human is to cast yourself above others, above other humans, above other species, above all other lives, and above all physical objects for their use and profit. On the flip side, to be non-human is deemed to be non-European, to be savage or indigenous, to be backwards, to be black, to be inferior, to be one-dimensional, to be subservient, to be dominated, to experience dispossession and precarity. To be non-human is to be cast below real humans. The ongoing result is the complete dispossession and exploitation of our whenua, kāinga and taonga, including our bodies, ideas, and culture. We are all striving to be good humans, but for some of us, that requires that we strive to dominate and exploit. And that's the ideology I see in the RSB. To suggest that good regulation sits with 6 libertarian values that value domination, private property rights, and the rights of corporations over all is to suggest that those who are deemed non-human deserve to be dominated, to be exploited, and to be subservient to landlords and rich investors. The 6 values in which Rawiri Seymour and his collaborators praise as the highest values of regulation show how inept Rawiri Seymour, the ACT Party, and the entire New Zealand government is in dreaming and in imagining a world which private property is not king, in which people can relate to each other outside of transactional arrangements of exploitation. Te Tiriti o Waitangi sets a framework for these relationships between tangata whenua and tangata tiriti that will honour the environment, honour tangata whenua, honour tangata tiriti, and honour our shared humanity. It is based on tikanga and kawa, which is the law of the land directly informed by our environment. The RSB intends to destroy any potential for this relationship to flourish. And so the constitutional framework of the New Zealand government has always been based on these values of domination. And for me, therefore, constitutional transformation is necessary on these lands for the people of Aotearoa to live and prosper together as a collective of many peoples. The work has and has been done at the community level, and I think this must continue, and we cannot and must not rely on government to do this work, as they have shown, like case in point, that the intentions are to further dispossess hapu and communities with the rule of law and to further divide and rule with propaganda. This bill contradicts and is oppositional to our shared humanity, which is why we must reject it. We must oppose it, and why it must never let it form the basis on which we interact with each other. We must instead transform the way in which we interact with each other by transforming our constitutional arrangements to a constitutional framework which honours the environment, honours the past, honours he whakaputanga o te rangatiratanga o Ngū Tireni, honours te tiriti o Waitangi, honours tikanga, honours kawa, and honours each other. Matike mai Aotearoa, rise up Aotearoa. Tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Tāwhana. You're right on 5 minutes. So, yeah, well timed.
Thank you.
Yeah, very succinct. Thank you very much. We're now going to welcome Ron Segal. in a individual submission as well. Ron, I can see you up online
Yes, I'm just unmuting myself.
Very good.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, committee, for the opportunity to speak. Firstly, I'd just like to say that I am in principle in favour of the bill that seeks to resolve New Zealand regulations that routinely violate basic democratic governance principles. This bill, in my estimation, could accomplish some of this through its set of general legislative principles, which seem reasonable, although quite limited. The requirement for responsible agencies to proactively engage in stewardship of regulations is useful. The requirement for regular reviews by agencies against principles via consistency accountability statements. The indicated regulatory standards board's ability to conduct inquiries into inconsistencies with standards is useful, although apparently missing more general reviews of agency stewardship, and the regulatory standards board's ability to ensure government agencies meet their regulatory standard reporting obligations is useful, particularly with ultimate redress to High Court. Having indicated those positives, my disappointment in this bill are threefold. Firstly, around enforcement. So although the bill provides extensive powers to request information, there are no specific remedies that I could see where legislation that falls below the standards. For example, perhaps a requirement for ministers and indeed responsible agencies to table remedial action plans within specified timeframes. Otherwise, this could end up becoming a framework with potentially costly ticking process requirements, but no meaningful consequences for poor compliance. The second disappointment is really about guidance. The guidance in the bill itself is very limited, with no specific tests against standards or corresponding examples. Definitions are sparse, with many key terms or phrases undefined: unduly diminish, good justification, fair compensation, proper relation, levy is reasonable, reasonably practicable with respect to consulting. However, I noted that legislation should preserve the court's constitutional role of ascertaining the meaning of legislation. So perhaps this is an excuse for missing definitions and examples. I'd question this. Surely good governance should avoid leaving broad scope for judicial interpretation of regulations contrary to Parliament's intent. Indeed, this is, in my view, has to be an important candidate for a key principle of regulation. Apart from clear definitions, I would like to have seen much better guidance to avoid misinterpretation, even perhaps avoiding the various current conspiracy theories about nefarious intent of the bill. Guidance possibly by including worked examples or use case scenarios. Thirdly, exemptions. Regulatory exemptions, it seems to me, are often leverage for political convenience. This bill could have been an opportunity to lay down a principle to reduce or avoid such poor governance behaviours. Instead, in my view, the bill itself is guilty of including exceptions that effectively violate its own principles, for example, by not stating the cost benefit or other reasons for an exception. So I'd recommend a principle that regulatory exceptions should not be used as a method of avoiding compliance with regulatory principles or similar. So in summary, generally, I'd expect a regulatory standards bill to itself be a very model of good regulation, which in my view, the bill in its current form isn't. It requires more teeth, much more comprehensive guidance and definitions, preferably with examples to avoid misinterpretation outside of Parliament's intent, and exclusion of exclusions other than for, say, circularity reasons. However, such a bill is needed because New Zealand's legislative process does not consistently follow basic good regulatory governance principles, in my view,
Ron,
such as those expressed in the bill.
We've gone slightly over, but Mark Cameron does have a question. Is it all right if we take a question?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you both, Mr. Chair and Ron. Thank you very much. Very good to see you both here online. Ron, you spoke about misinterpretation of the law given the judicial branch, less so the Crown and its role as the sovereign power, you might say, of New Zealand. Can you give us some examples where you've seen misinterpretation from the Crown via the courts in New Zealand and where that's played out?
I think, yeah, I mean, some of that is, from what I've seen, is a lot of what's been talked about today, and that's on the treaty itself. So when I look at what is a very simple document signed in 1840, what's often talked about in the courts and indeed by government is features that are such as active protection. That's one example. That's not in the treaty, yet it's talked about as though it is in the treaty, both by government and particularly by the courts. So that's one example. I think it would be more honest to say that active protection is a policy. It's not in the treaty, but it's decided more recently that it's going to be a policy.
Thank you.
Anyway,
Thank you. Very good answer. Very grateful for your answer. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. Thank you, Ron. We're now going to move to the Opportunities Party. I believe we've got Cail online. If I did your name correctly.
Am I coming through well?
Yep, can hear you. Good. Thank you. We've got you for 10 minutes, but of course, if you can finish a little bit earlier, it presents us with the opportunity to ask questions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Cail Smith, and I welcome the chance to speak on behalf of TOP, the Opportunities Party. TOP is a political party founded in 2016 that exists to champion and pursue policy that affords every Kiwi equal opportunity to pursue their potential in ways that are socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable. TOP earned the votes of over 60,000 New Zealanders in 2023 who believed in our vision to address political challenges at a fundamental and long-term level, rather than tinkering at the edges and favouring the status quo. TOP opposes the legislation and sees it as redundant and lacking the additional efficacy touted by supporters, while also raising legislative liability for our country. If passed, despite the well-documented and overwhelming opposition, it would undermine not only key democratic principles and the enduring precedent of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but also some of the foundational principles of the bill itself. The bill is so resoundingly divisive that the opposition has already committed to repeal, potentially making this a complete and utter waste of time, money, and political capital. Simply put, there are two possibilities. One, either the bill achieves its presumed objective of constraining the regulation making of future governments more than already allowed by current systems, or two, the bill does not constrain future regulation and is ignored or repealed by future governments. The first possibility is the bill will constrain decision-making in a way that is inconsistent with regulatory best practice and the expectations most New Zealanders have of their government. The bill is ideologically narrow. It only reflects one view of what regulation is, mainly protecting private property and limiting the role of government. It ignores the many other reasons we regulate, like protecting human life, preventing unsafe building, protecting the environment, or addressing inequality. It puts short-term economic interest above long-term public need. The bill arbitrarily protects the current economic setup, ignoring past injustices and how economies change over time. The present state of affairs and the decisions that have led to it are not deserving of special protection. Should the government have been impeded from introducing the regulatory changes that enabled ride-sharing companies to disrupt the taxi industry, allowed the initial introduction of the Hauraki Gulf Marine Sanctuary, or enabled our space sector to emerge? Should a future government be impeded from regulating emerging technology like AI to protect New Zealanders, to enable growth, or both? This bill opens the door to a concept of regulatory taking that is so broad it can impose near unlimited liability on future governments. Should existing payday loan companies, for example, have been compensated for the investments they made when annual interest rates were capped, when previously there was no regulation on what they could charge? Treasury, not normally known for their radicalism, argues a similar point by saying the bill could impose costs on agencies exceeding the potential and economic and societal benefit. The second possibility is that the bill will not prevent future governments from regulating as they please, as its provisions are not binding. If this happens, the bill will have merely proved a waste of this committee's time and public service resources used to develop and implement it. By failing to meaningfully engage and blithely ignoring opposition to the bill, its supporters have ensured the second scenario will be the reality sooner or later. The opposition has already confirmed they will repeal the bill. TOP is not opposed to the concept of regulating to improve the quality of regulation, although we are hardly convinced this bill will genuinely facilitate this. In any case, quasi-constitutional matters like this need to be executed with a view to building an enduring consensus that will survive multiple governments. Our primary recommendation is the bill be withdrawn as it fails on several essential fronts. Consultation has been poorly sought and seemingly disregarded. There is an unprecedented public rejection of the bill, with as little as 0.33% of public submissions in favour of the proposed legislation per the Ministry of Regulation's own regulatory impact statement. And lastly, the bill appears to propose several significant concerns, ironically introducing a layer of red tape. I thank the committee for your time and your genuine consideration. I welcome questions if you have any.
Thank you, Cail. Appreciate your submission, both written and today, oral. There doesn't appear to be any questions, but I'd like to thank you for coming in and submitting all the same.
Thank you all for having me.
Committee, we've got one more submission and then we'll have a short break. This is with the Northland Urban Rural Mission. I think Tim Howard is online. Welcome, Tim.
Kia ora mai. Tēnā koutou ngā karangatanga maha te motu, and greetings to the committee and acknowledgements of all the submitters that I've been listening to today. Thank you for the privilege to address you today. We regret that there's only 30 hours for oral submissions to be heard. A bill with such constitutional impact as this needs more thorough scrutiny. To clarify for the Minister, I'm not a bot. I'm Tim Howard of the Northland Urban Rural Mission, a church and community collective that has worked for social justice, community development, and community justice since the early 1980s. Parliament has 3 times rejected the regulatory standards bill's predecessors. The proposing minister has not taken on board substantial critiques of what might be called his pet project. He is closed-minded about the rejection of the bill by the Waitangi Tribunal, legal experts, academics, Māori, the public, and even his own ministry's officials. We, however, ask that the Select Committee recommend that this bill be withdrawn and that New Zealand First be consistent and vote against the bill. The bill is unnecessary. We note that the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee, the law experts, if lawmaking experts, stated that there were already mechanisms in place to oversee the lawmaking process, and though these mechanisms could perhaps be strengthened, a new law was not needed. And they criticised the specific principles in the bill, calling them selective and deeply contestable. We note that no evidence of the size of the problem to justify the bill's aim to reduce regulation is provided. The bill is unnecessary. What stands out in the bill is its silence about Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the principles of the treaty. Their silence is deafening. It treats Te Tiriti as a nullity, just as Justice Prendergast did in 1877. We submit that any significant constitutional legislation must source its validity in Te Tiriti itself and its values. The bill's absence of reference to Te Tiriti o Waitangi and its principles serves to reinforce the worst of colonising policies and gives power to new policies overtaking tangata whenua again. The principles of the treaty are also conspicuous by their absence. These principles are now more closely approximate to Te Tiriti o Waitangi that the rangatira of 1840 signed. Rangatiratanga, manakitanga, kaitiakitanga, equity, partnership, and more. Excluding Te Tiriti and its principles and leaving regulatory decision-making to the Minister and the Regulatory Standards Board, guided by limited libertarian principles, serves to strengthen colonial structures controlling Māori communities. The bill is an exercise in denial, ignoring the substantial historical injustices against Māori, while at the same time disempowering any attempts at affirmative action to offer redress for those injustices. It has the effect that moves supporting rangatiratanga are left open to subsequent challenging by corporates, and tangata whenua be forced to pay again for the expropriation that they've already suffered. With others, we say, toi tu te tiriti. This bill overthrows a number of our constitutional arrangements. The bill removes the legitimate constitutional role of Te Tiriti, just as the ill-fated principles of the treaty bill attempted to do. It purports to narrow down lawmaking to a few libertarian principles. In effect, it sets itself up as a parent law, overseeing other parliamentary lawmaking, and centralises increased power to the executive and primarily to the Minister for Regulation. For example, it is the Minister of Regulation who would be empowered by this bill to call for investigations and to issue guidelines on how the principles will be interpreted. The Minister is all-powerful, backed by a hand-picked statutory standards board, mainly economists, which interferes with the work of MPs who are elected and accountable. The current important work of the Regulations Review Committee is ignored in the policy work supporting this bill. The bill's extreme simplicity overrides the checks and balances essential to a functioning democracy. For example, the bill's principles are structured so that they're not able to be addressed by the courts, thus cutting against the constitutional principle of the separation of powers. The bill also weakens the basic principle in our Constitution of ministerial responsibility, as it seeks to empower the Minister for Regulation alone. Overall, the bill is constitutionally deficient and should be rejected on those grounds. The principles cited in Clause 8 in the bill may each have some justification individually. However, they are a very limited cohort of principles, are reflections of the values of the ACT Party and their fellow travellers. They are, to quote, selective and deeply contestable. These principles are individualistic, favouring corporate and property rights, and omit a number of principles that must be seen as essential to good lawmaking. There are a number of principles that are not in the bill. These include the Treaty Waitangi and the principles of the treaty, the public harm principle, principles of distributive justice where the basic needs of all people are met, protection of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and the principle of that the government is obliged to follow its international legal obligations. These and many more are not included in the principles in Clause 8. The Bill's narrow principles omit so much. Embedding any political direction, especially this neoliberal direction, into wide-ranging legislation like this bill is simply wrong. Coupled with the powers proposed for the Standards Board and the Minister, these principles lead to a dangerously narrow focus for all lawmaking. They lead to poor lawmaking. Finally, with its emphasis on property rights and individualism, the bill will likely give significant power to corporations and to wealthy individuals to pressure government not to be addressing the needs of mana whenua communities and of the environment. It also leaves government, iwi and hapu, NGOs and communities liable to legal attacks as soon as corporates have any perception of having lost anticipated profits. The regulatory takings clause of the bill will have a deadening effect. Corporates can easily threaten to litigate against any policies that are pro-environment, pro-social, pro-human rights, pro-workers, if they are deemed detrimental to the corporate's profit-taking. And of course, many corporations would like to be free from regulation. That the bill seeks to go a long way down that direction is extremely damaging. For these and other reasons, we ask that the Select Committee recommends the bill's rejection. Kia mai tātou.
Thank you, Tim, and Northland Urban Rural Mission for your comprehensive submission. That we don't appear to have any questions, so we'll thank you for your submission, and we'll end there.
Kia ora mai. Thank you very much. Reject the bill.
Kia ora. Committee, we're actually a few minutes early now, so we can have an afternoon tea break and meet back just before 10 minutes past 3. Thank you.